Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi wahda wa salatu wa salamu ala man la nabiya ba'da. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I know you wanted to introduce me, but I think we've gone on a lunch break pretty much. And so probably in the interest of time, it's khair and better that I don't be introduced. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Undur ila ma qal, la tandur ila man qal." Look at what a person says, not who says it. So inshallah, without knowing who I am, you'll be able to evaluate whether I have some legitimacy or something useful to say, inshallah ta'ala. So what I wanted to discuss today is simply understanding what is the difference between, say, what we're calling an Islamic psychology practitioner. And in our framework, if you're familiar with the work that we do, we call this a TIIP professional or practitioner. Tıp, not tıp like in Turkish, Türkçe'de gibi değil, tıp fakültesi. No, not tip like that, but TIIP, Traditional Islamically Integrated Psychotherapy. So really, I'm going to draw upon what we've written about in our book. We have a book in chapter 2 where Dr. Abdullah actually is also an author, is a co-author with myself on that chapter. So I'll be able to kind of present to you a framework for understanding what is the role and scope of a Islamic psychology practitioner or an Islamic psychologist, we can say. So we need to define and understand the parameters of that. And then, so one of the central questions that we need to ask, right, which begs the question, is what is the difference between a psychologist and a Sufi? Right? Because sometimes people make the allegation, oh, you're going to use the dhikr in your sessions, you're going to use Quran and Sunnah in your sessions, then you are a Hoja, right? What separates you from doing the work of a Hoja, Madrasa Hoja, not university Hoja, right? And not versus a psychologist. And the psychologist will allege that you're taking science and you're bringing religion and you're making it into religion, right? And then on the other side, religious folks will say that, well, you are psychologizing Islam, right? You're psychologizing Islam. On the other side, they'll say you're Islamicizing psychology. So we're between these two dilemmas. And so we need to define the terrain. We need to define the scope. It's a reasonable question, right? Because why? Both mental health professionals, psychologists, as well as theologians, hojas, Sufi sheikhs, they aspire to change these three things. They try to change your beliefs, right? If you're a CBT practitioner, you're working with beliefs. You're working with thinking. What does the Quran say? يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اجْتَنِبُوا كَثِيرًا مِنَ الظَّنِّ إِنَّ بَعْضَ الظَّنِّ إِثْمٌ عَسَىٰ أَن تَكْرَهُوا شَيْئًا وَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. Prophet Allah Ta'ala is changing our thinking. Abstain from some particular types of thoughts. They may be evil unto you. Keep in perspective that difficulty in trials and tribulations, which Sheikh Yusuf is going to speak about, is khair for you. So what are they doing? We're getting a perspective shift, right? And cognitive psychologists say we need to cognitively restructure and change your beliefs. If we go to emotions, the Prophet ﷺ says, لا تحزن, لا تغضب. Right? Ali radiallahu anhu says, أحبب حبيبك هونا ما. Right? أبغض بغيضك هونا ما. That hate your enemy moderately, love your enemy, love your beloved moderately. All of these discussions about emotions, regulation of your emotions. What does psychology say? We need to do emotional regulation, emotional transformation. Right? What about behaviors? Changing your behaviors. Well, the religion tells us to do nahi an munkar, and to amr bil ma'ruf. It tells us all sorts of actions and prescriptions that we find in the Sharia that you should do and how you should behave with individuals, right? أعطي من حرمك. Give to the one who deprives you. It's an action, right, statement. Allah Ta'ala is telling, the Prophet ﷺ is telling us to do something. Well, in psychology, they tell us, change your behaviors, change your lifestyle, change certain repertoires in order to facilitate health. So then the question is, well, if we have all this sort of overlap on the same terrain that we're working on, the same space, then how do we differentiate between, say, a psychologist and a theologian, a hujjah? And then how do we sort of find some space that may be this Islamic psychologist, right? So we need to answer this question for ourselves. First of all, let's talk about the commonalities, right? Before we get into defining the scope and the differences between them. The commonalities are the following. First of all, there is almost a consensus among Islamic scholars that development of yourself needs to be done under mentorship. You need to go to some expert in order to be able to develop yourself, develop your thinking, develop your emotions, develop your behavior, develop your spirituality. This is a statement from the Ihya, Mukhtasar Ihya of Imam al-Ghazali. He says, he starts with a statement, a tradition, an Islamic tradition, and he says, إِذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ بِعَبْدًا خَيْرًا إِذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ بِعَبْدِهِ خَيْرًا بَصَّرُهُ بِعُيُوبِ نَفْسِهِ. If Allah Ta'ala wants good for a believer, khayr for a believer, He will give him awareness of his own deficiencies. So the idea of knowing what your shortcomings are, finding those shortcomings, the sources of those shortcomings is important, and you have to go to somebody to be able to facilitate that journey. Well, he says as a recommendation, who should you go to? You should go to a sheikh. Shaykhan, he says, وَلِهَذِهِ الْمَعْرِفَةِ طُرُقٌ. First, he says there's multiple ways. It's very important. And keep this in mind when I come to the role of the Islamic psychologist. He says multiple ways. One way is to go to a sheikh of tasawwuf, right? And that you وَيَشْتَغِلُ بِمَا يَأْمُرُهُ فَعِنْدَ ذَلِكَ يَنْكَشِفُ لَهُ وَتَارَةً يُكْشِفُ لَهُ شَيْخُهُ. Sometimes you become aware on your own. The sheikh, you ever seen the Yunus Emre? Yunus Emre goes to the Dizi. He goes to the to Tapduk Emre, and then he's suggesting that, can I help you solve this dilemma? I have lots of knowledge of inheritance law. I can help you solve this problem, sheikh. And the sheikh says, this person is kibr. So he says, you will do the Ben bin Mem zikr. Okay, the zikr of I don't know. Okay, is what he's prescribed. So it's to give him a prescription. So now he makes him aware, as he's doing this, it's very hard for me. So I become aware that there must be something wrong. Or that the sheikh tells me directly that something is wrong. Right? Then we look at Imam al-Razi, who is a tabib, a physician from the philosophical medicine literature in the Islamic tradition. And he says the same thing, except he doesn't say a sheikh, right? From the healthcare tradition, he says, and he describes, and I'll summarize it in the interest of time. It's up here, the Arabic, for those who are interested. Because an individual is not able to gain awareness of their own deficiencies or to prohibit their passions, because they typically, what do? It's a self-serving bias, we call this in psychology, self-serving bias. Meaning they always find some excuse for themselves. They always prefer themselves. So you're always trying to do istihsan, make what you're doing have a justification, a rationalization. Because of this reason, it's hard for an individual to know their own deficiencies, right? So if it's hard to know it, then how can you remove something that you're not aware? So then he cuts in the next paragraph after this, he says you need a mushrif over yourself, whom will supervise and serve as your guide and mentor, in which you will take their companionship, and that they will tell you about your shortcomings, inform you of your shortcomings, and then try to help you with your shortcomings. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi gives further rationale in Al-Masalih al-Anfus wal-Abdan as to why this is important, because he says that it is more likely that an individual accepts a yaqbala يقبل من غيره أكثر مما يقبل من نفسه. That a person is more likely to accept the advice sometimes of another person than their own advice. Sometimes you see our patients, they're very critical of themselves and they say, I don't trust myself. I don't know what I'm saying is reasonable or unreasonable. And the person says, it seems reasonable. You validate that sort of idea. Right? And then sometimes, he says, the second reason is because when you're overwhelmed by your emotions, then your reasoning becomes compromised, and so you need somebody else to draw attention to this. So the conclusion of this is what? That you should go to somebody. You need to go to somebody to help you with your personal, psychological, spiritual development, to be aware of your underlying issues. Okay? So then, who do we go to? Imam al-Ghazali said, well, we have a sheikh on the one hand, but there's multiple pathways. Imam Abu Bakr al-Razi, al-Tabib, says you go to this mushrif, a supervisor. And others say a hakim, you go to this wise, hikmah. Right? The notion of going to a physician, more of a healthcare practitioner, a wise counsel. So then, where is this Islamic psychologist? What are you? Are we just giving you certificates in Islamic psychology as ISIP, IEIP, Islamic International Association for Islamic Psychology, as Khalil Center, TIP, and then we made you a sheikh, and then we give you a jubbah at the end, right? We give the jubbah to everybody, right? When I came to Turkey, actually, just as a quick aside, I was actually on the phone with my mom, and my father was there, and in the room. And she said, now that you're in Turkey in universities, right, teaching at a university, did the other Muslim hujjas, right, to convince you to wear a suit instead of this jubbah? Is my dad is telling my mom to ask this to me, and then my mom says to him, he says, I don't think you know your son by now. She said, I'm more concerned that he's going to make them wear jubbas. So, not that I do this. I don't wear the jubbas. You don't get the jubbah when you're done. So we need to decide what is the scope. What are we giving you once you're done with your degree, once you're done with your certification? So let's define the scope. So here's the proposed scope. First of all, it's very clear already, this much we know, that a mental health practitioner generally works on what? Psychological functioning. And then we have a Sufi or a Hoja works on spiritual functioning, right? That's the easy one, but then it gets all complicated because there's so much overlap. So here's this chart to try to break this down. Look at the chart on the board, on the slideshow. I think you're on the wrong slideshow. You're not following me. This is right here. We have functioning. If we look at functioning, we have psychological function, we have spiritual functioning. When we say mental illness, psychological dysfunction, right, we can break that down into biological, like meaning endogenous psychological conditions, and exogenous or reactive conditions, right? Those things that are in your body typically need what? I mean, this is an oversimplification, but they need generally medications, right? So that's kind of easy. What we're doing is psychiatry manipulating the chemical imbalance in your mind, in your brain, and then you have kind of a resolution. But then we have psychological functioning, which is non-physical, meaning that you have a low serotonin, right, a neurotransmitter at the synapse, but it's as a result of your beliefs and your environment and things that you've experienced, right? And so that's what we would call like psychological disorders. That's the terrain. I just want you to pay attention. I'm not referring to those that are biologically oriented, right? Because there isn't as much overlap between the biological, psychological conditions and spirituality. But in the case of environmental or reactive type of psychological conditions, it's actually rooted in the psyche. What is the psyche? Psychology is such a profession that nobody can define the subject matter that we're working on, right? You go to a physician, I'm working on your arm. What is the arm? I can describe it. What is the psyche? Allah knows best, right? So want to qualify, then I believe it is the mind or the spirit, the qalb, right, aspect. But the psychologist is working on different areas of the psyche. We're working on psychological disorders in the interest of functioning, typically depression, anxiety, etc., that serves as clinical dysfunction. On the other side, the other extreme, spiritual development is about working with diseases of the heart. But we have overlap between the two. What's the overlap? Here's an example. Take narcissistic personality disorder. Narcissistic personality disorder compromises your functioning. It's a clinical syndrome. I work with that as a psychologist. But let's say that individual has narcissism, right? And if it's significant, narcissism, then it will do what? It will be disease of the heart, right? And therefore the Sufi sheikh is working on eradicating this because it will be a problem for their spirituality. But then we have the shared space of a non-clinical disorder, let's say, narcissism, and it's impacting their marriage, for example. But it's not a clinical disorder. It's not a clinical dysfunction. It's generally sort of impacting their overall well-being. That's an area of shared space, and what I would call that is resilience, virtue, and character development, and relationships. And so the psychologist is both working on psychological disorder, the Sufi sheikh is working on disease of the heart, and they're separate. They don't touch each other, okay? They work in their own lanes. And then you have this overlapping space, and that is character development typically, right? And they do so for different aims usually. Oftentimes psychologists for bettering resilience, right? Resilience and psychological functioning. And then the Sufi sheikh is doing it for what? Kamal, spiritual perfection, trying to create insan al-kamil, right? So I'm going to actually jump through this. So the goal of the Sufi sheikh is, okay, skip that. This is Buriya Bakwan's last. Ama bu şey, bu gidiyor o zaman. Translation yapamıyor. Ama öyle olmuyor. Tüm ekranın hepsini alıyor. Okay. Then we have, so the Sufi sheikh is working on Kamal. The psychologist is working on psychological, healthy psychological functioning. Okay? And so the Islamically integrated psychotherapist then, what is this integrated space? We can give them sort of another term, right? And that term, at least the term that Imam al-Ghazali gives them, is the Rafiq. He says, وَطَرِيقًا أُخْرَى. It's interesting. There's another path. There's another person that you can go to. Who is this other person? He's a Rafiq. Rafiq denotes authoritativeness, and he's going to explain what he means by that. It's not an authority figure like a sheikh. It's less than that. However, he's still authoritative because he's going to describe it. He says, أَيَطْلُبَ رَفِيقًا صَالِحًا عَالِمًا بِأَسْرَارِ هَذَا الْأَمْرِ. That he is a salih, first of all, he's righteous, and that he is عَالِمًا بِأَسْرَارِ هَذَا الْأَمْرِ. Which matter? Which matter is he an expert in changing human conditions, in helping them understand their deficiencies. Right? فَيَصْحُبُهُ وَيَجْعَلُهُ رَفِيقًا عَلَى نَفْسِهِ لِيُلَاحِظَ أَحْوَالَهُ وَيُنَبِّهَهُ عَلَى عُيُوبِهِ. And he says, you take this person as a mentor, you help them develop yourself to uncover all of your shortcomings and to help you realize your shortcomings. So, the Islamic psychotherapist can be, we can see from this term, Rafiq, or Khalil Center, we might call him a Khalil, right? Will be somewhere in the middle. And that is that he's not quite the secular type of all medical type practice, that he's just focusing exclusively on secular psychological functioning. The Sufi sheikh is, he's not doing tasawwuf, right? But he's somewhere in the middle. So for example, I may give a dhikr to somebody with OCD. I tell them to go after every salah, say, Ya Rahman Rahim, Ya Ghafur Rahim, right? And then say this on a tasbih 100 times after every salah. Now you may say, oh, now you're a Sufi. What are you doing? You're giving him a wazifa, right? You're giving him a litany, a prescription. But my goal is to shift this i'tidad, this balance of this person has too much fear, right? Too much pessimism. I want to give him more optimism, right? Whereas a Sufi sheikh may do that as well. However, oftentimes you need a wazifa in order for spiritual development. So as a spiritual elevation as part of your goal. So I'm not just giving zikr just because, right? But I'm giving it in the interest of serving some form of either psychological resiliency development or psychological correction as a result of dysfunction. So we're kind of somewhere in the middle, you can see. And that's the goal. And the other characteristics that Imam al-Ghazali highlights is that this person must be upright in their character, salihan, right? Saduqan, right? They say in other places they talk about this. So adilan, somebody who's just, right? So how do you define that, by the way? Adala. There are multiple definitions. One of the most common ones is to refrain from major sins and to not insist on small sins. That's a basic level of criterion for even in a court for your testimony to be acceptable, right? So that you should be working on your own personal development to be honest and upright so that you don't engage in major sins, which means that going to a therapist is disqualified if they're engaging in major sins. If they're engaging in repeated insistence on minor sins, would disqualify a therapist, and one who's seeking a therapist should not seek out that therapist, right, for their development. You hand over power of suggestion and manipulation of your inner psyche to somebody who has a fundamental issue, right? And I'm not saying, and there's obviously a spectrum, right? Everybody should be working on their personal development. But this is a very objective criterion. Should not be engaging in major sin and should not be insistent. Of course, everybody commits minor sins, but insistently committing minor sins with a certain degree of stubbornness, right? Another one is companionship denoting authoritative relationship. And the last one is aliman bi asrari hadha al-amr, that they should have base level of competencies, right, in this arena. They should know what they are doing. So that's kind of the framework that I want to outline. If you just go down 2 more slides. And then here is a chart. You can read it from our book. I don't want to go through it. I've given you a basic framework. It gives you sort of the common issues that we're talking about, authority, and then we're describing them for all 3, sort of your secular psychologist, and then you have your, Sufi sheikh, and then the Rafiq that we outline in the middle. So we sort of talk about what are the characteristics that are necessary for them. Yeah, I think this is enough, actually. So this gives you a good framework for situating sort of the Islamic psychologists. Jazakumullahu khair wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Human Keshavarzi. Before you go, Dr. Human, I would like to present you, actually, even though you're such a humble person who...
Present what?
Present who you are.
Oh.
I mean, most people know who you are, but Dr. Human is one of the leading scholars in contemporary application and research in Islamic psychology, founder of Khalil Center, also working here as a teacher at Ibn Khaldun University and also with research. And many of us who have done the TIIP program this week and last year have met him in the function of actually one of our teachers. And if you want to know more about Dr. Human and his team's work, feel free to visit Khalil Center's website. We will also share all those resources. Thank you so much, Dr. Human, for being with us. You're such an honor. We want to give you a gift here as well. Sister Fatima will give it to you. And sister, you can also translate to Turkish, inshallah.